This video is sponsored by Raycon. Hey, before we begin, I want to give a shout out to cool channel DreadTube, who beat me to the punch on this specific topic months ago. After making my video, I came across their essay, which I normally try to avoid when covering similar topics, that I feel dives even deeper into concepts I cover based on the book that establishes the film's thesis, The Gift of Fear, so I highly recommend you give them a watch if you enjoyed this topic and want to learn more. I've left a link in the description box below, and I want to give a wholehearted thank you to them for giving me the blessing to release this video. For the most part, Barbarian is a cleverly made film. While I personally don't think it sticks the landing in its third and final act, I want to talk about what I think the film does so impeccably well, and that's character. Now, do keep in mind we are jumping into spoilers fairly quickly, so you've been warned from the get-go. Also, you might hear a few audio changes throughout. That's because I ended up rewriting and expanding on the video because I wasn't happy with the original outcome, but anyway. As a brief summary, the first act of Barbarian tells the story of Tess, a young professional attending a job interview in Detroit, where she discovers she's double booked into the same Airbnb as another stranger called Keith. They exchange tense, awkward pleasantries with a massive asterisk and attempt to find a reasonable compromise, only for them to later discover a hidden passage in the basement that leads to a dark labyrinth of tunnels that house something truly sinister. The second act introduces us to AJ, a Hollywood actor accused of committing the evil R in the case of YouTube censorship, who returns to said Airbnb, which he happens to own, in a bid to liquidate the asset to pay for his legal costs. Eventually, in Act 3, the characters intercept each other as they try to survive, while learning about the historical horror buried deep within the house. The film is essentially one part social thriller and the other part creature feature, the former being its most unique and enticing element, even eliciting borderline Hitchcockian vibes, while the latter has this misplaced French extremity-esque shock factor that left me deeply conflicted. The thing is, Barbarian is better treated as a character study than simply a traditional narrative. It takes several distinct perspectives and subtly shows their personal attitudes, behaviours and beliefs towards tense, dangerous and even just awkward situations, with the scenes of each character entering the mysterious basement at separate times, perfectly consolidating their characters. This is most noticeable through Tess and AJ, as we get extended scenes focusing on their distinct attitudes towards the overtly shady and obviously dangerous looking basement, but we'll come back to that shortly once we've established the full context of the story. In an interview with writer-director Zach Krager, the movie spawned from a 30-minute treatment script based on security specialist Gavin DeBecker's self-help book The Gift of Fear, Survival Signals That Protect Us from Violence. The book is equal parts insightful as it is deeply harrowing, with the framing focusing around a real victim who intuitively sensed danger from a man claiming to be a helpful neighbour, but didn't associate his image and behaviour with that of an attacker. In the most simplistic sense, you'll see this recurring theme throughout both the film and DeBecker's book about looks being deceiving, and how our natural survival instincts signal important information we can't always outwardly see. In DeBecker's words, the book isn't about assuming every individual is up to nefarious means, it's about being able to rationalize your instincts and know when to act upon them. Thus, instead of living in fear, you react better to what is actually happening as opposed to what could happen. In the first act of Barbarian, we see this play out entirely through Tess's eyes, as she shows an acute awareness and reading of her surroundings. After arriving at the Airbnb, her reaction to Keith is understandably defensive and cautious. She's careful not to make herself vulnerable as she assesses the uncertainty of the situation, taking in the fact that she's alone in an unfamiliar setting with a mysterious man in the dead of night, even wisely photographing Keith's ID when alone in the bedroom in case something were to transpire. Keith, on the other hand, grows increasingly self-conscious in his hyper-awareness of how the situation might look. Again, he's a tall, strong-looking dude in an empty house alone with a woman he doesn't know. There's a social etiquette at play, let's say, where he doesn't want to give off the wrong vibe while inadvertently calling attention to it in his efforts to diffuse the tension that exists. The first key signal Tess elicits is when she declines Keith's seemingly polite offer to make her tea, but he makes it anyway, suggesting he could have drugged it, or he could have also just tried too hard to be nice, despite ignoring her clear decline. This is later followed up when Keith decides to open a bottle of wine, but waits until Tess is in the room so she can see he has not tampered with it. On the one hand, he seems to be showing respect and forethought, but on the other, he's potentially pushing his boundaries by introducing alcohol into an uncertain situation. Now, of course, some will rebuke that I'm overthinking a simple situation, but as De Becker explains in his book, it's a mentality that naturally triggers in situations where we certainly feel a lack of safety or control. The point is, there are so many nuances at play in how you choose to interpret the interaction, because the truth is, while they do get to know each other on a more intimate level, they never stop being strangers. Keith in particular appears sincere thanks to Bill Skarsgård's immense and delicate charisma, but much like how the house seems so perfect in a neighbourhood we discover is ravaged by dilapidation, eventually mirroring the discoveries of certain characters, underneath the surface we can never see the true intent of anyone. In fact, taking into account Skarsgård's most prolific performance was playing a stalking, child-murdering clown, playing against somewhat of a type was a brilliant casting decision. In De Becker's words, there are 7 tactics used by perpetrators that, in a different light, can change how we evaluate the uncertainty of Keith's character. You have force teaming, which sees Keith collectively tie them equally into the same tense situation through rapport, charm and niceness being used as a verb instead of a trait, overselling specific details to make Tess forget situational context, typecasting, which is labeling the victim in an insulting manner to invite defense, which we see in Keith pointing out Tess to be weak and vulnerable, loan sharking, where Keith shows too much insistence to be helpful, as gentlemanly as it may seem, also further making Tess seem dependent on him, the unsolicited promise, which comes later when he goes to investigate the basement but asks her to wait so they can leave together, and the last one, clear through the tea, discounting the word no. While Keith absolutely appears genuine and is ultimately proven to be so, quoting De Becker, chivalry can be dangerous if insisted upon given the circumstances. Again, we cannot truly predict anyone's behaviour, and through Tess's eyes, he is still ultimately a stranger. To conclude this before we move on to the basement, one of De Becker's points in his chapter Imperfect Strangers discusses how some people operate without listening to their consciences or caring about the welfare of others, which perfectly summarizes AJ's character, as we'll come to see later. But just as equally, others operate the opposite way, and so part of our intuition and assessment comes from empathizing with the person we're with, to see it from their perspective. The point isn't to drop your guard, it's actually to inform and reinforce it, enter an alliance with the self, as De Becker calls it, and in turn better gauge your judgment as intelligently as Tess does. So, this leads us to the basement, where Tess discovers a secret door that leads to a room clearly designed to imprison someone with sinister intent, like snuff film purposes, prompting her to tell Keith, who decides to investigate it for himself. We never see him enter the hidden basement, but his curiosity to investigate without caution instead of noping the hell out of there like Tess does, tells us a lot about his character and his demeanour towards these types of situations. Personally, given my anxious disposition, I would be like Tess, and definitely not go down there. I'm the kind of person that, in unfamiliar spaces, likes to know where the exit is in case I need to bail for whatever reason. That said, I do know people who would have absolutely no problem going down there without questioning their safety because, as De Becker even puts it in his book, some people, mostly us dudes, just go through life without ever thinking anything bad will happen to them. When Tess hears Keith screams and reluctantly decides to help, the movie makes entering the basement a gruelingly uncomfortable watch. We enter from an empathetic point of view and witness the unknowingness unfold firsthand through Tess's eyes. Before entering, there's a sense of voyeurism to the camera lurking around her, that's then pressed close to her when she enters the basement to convey both claustrophobia and the emotional attachment we have for her character and safety, with subtle heartbeats intensifying both our shared fear and anxiety for what's to come. You can palpably feel the energy pulling you back up upstairs. You want to leave, but what maintains Tess's desperate descent is the fact we've built a rapport with Keith that he effectively radiates a sense of companionship in this lonely, scary place. This of course ends with a harrowing crescendo when an injured Keith stumbles out of the darkness only to be barbarically murdered by a multi-generational inbred naked lady who is the product of decades of abusive incest. Yeah, this will all make sense later. However, you know what makes sense now? This video sponsor, Raycon. Whether you're looking for a pair of everyday earbuds, low latency gaming headphones, or a speaker with a battery that will last all night at your next party, Raycon's got you covered. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know I use Raycon earbuds on a daily basis, thanks to their simple, accessible features and genuinely excellent sound quality. With 3 customizable sound profiles that cater to what I'm listening to, Raycons are perfect for helping me de-stress after a long day of making videos, as I use balanced sound when watching suspenseful films like Prisoners, pure sound when listening to the Creepy Magnus Archives podcast, thank you to those who recently recommended it, and just the other day I was reading the script for the Ghost Story 222 and threw on bass sound while listening to some spooky ambience to really heighten the effect. Particularly these last few weeks, I've had an influx of work calls, and instead of relying on my built-in grainy laptop mic, Raycons provide vividly clear voice quality, and with only a few taps of the earbud, Raycon reduces the absolute hassle of bulky headsets and awkward cables, and just makes my whole work process easier and engaging. With over 50,000 5-star reviews, a free return guarantee, and starting at half the price of other premium audio brands, if you're ready to buy something small with a big impact and help support my channel, simply click the link in the description box below or go to buyraycon.com/Ryan to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. Okay, so where was I? Oh yes, following this disturbing reveal, the movie switches to the perspective of the happy-go-lucky AJ, who's met with accusations of assault from a former co-star, causing his television pilot to be cancelled and his management to cut ties with him, with potential criminal charges pending. During this, we're still dwelling on the shock of Keith's death and Tess's uncertain fate, while slowly adjusting ourselves to a boisterous character that feels straight out of Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The major contrasting point of his character is that he painfully lacks in both self-awareness and self-reflection and is in denial of his behaviour. Hell, the movie even later tries to give him a fake redemption arc where in a moment of vulnerability he acknowledges his terrible behaviour only to immediately regress back into it because he's the hero of his own narrative. When AJ enters the basement, the delivery is completely different. Like Keith, he overlooks the signs of danger to fulfill his own desires, which in this case is the excitement of being able to claim more square footage on his property, increasing its value thanks to a murder sex dungeon he doesn't seem to notice.
Yeah, bitch.
As he follows the dark, ominous tunnels with a tape measure, the camera work is slightly less claustrophobic compared to Tess, reflecting his utter lack of fear and contemplation for what this place is, which, to be honest, besides his shitness, I know people who would have no quarrels assessing the square footage of a mysterious basement if it was on their property. An interesting artistic choice between the mirroring between Tess and AJ's experience is the choice of lighting. Tess uses a white LED on her phone, giving off this cool yet bright, alerting exposure, which for me is more terrifying and dramatically impacts the presentation, more so than the orange, warm, isolated beam of AJ's torch, which I think further reflects his confident energy. It also adapts the atmosphere somewhat, as we've grown a sense of familiarity by this point. With the main ambiguity gone, we build a certain confidence in our expectations. Obviously, this is quickly lost when the woman attacks AJ, reverting the camera work back to the claustrophobia conveyed with Tess. Soon, AJ ends up trapped in a cage with Tess, who's apparently been down here for 2 weeks, and before their escape commences, we switch to basement entry number 3 from the perspective of the film's actual villain. Now, before we get into that, let's address the elephant in the room, the multi-generational inbred naked lady who's the product of decades of abusive incest. So I guess my main problem with Barbarian is that it kinda wants to have its cake and eat it, in that it's trying to be this virtuous, socially conscious look at power dynamics and human interaction, and also be a bit of a B-movie that comes at the expense of its true victim, the multi-generational inbred naked lady. Look, I get the premise of the film's theme theme is that looks can be deceiving, that we can't know the true intent of anyone's character, such as when Tess is seemingly harassed by a homeless man only for it later to show he was trying to warn her, and then of course you have all of Keith's behaviour, but in the context of its big reveal, it comes off to me that they're trying to treat the victim of abuse as a misunderstood monster, as it were, which I wouldn't have a problem with if it didn't hammer up so much in the final 15 minutes when she kills AJ and the homeless man before being shot dead by Tess, almost kinda cynically. It seems to undermine its own commentary by robbing its biggest victim of justice, which yes, tragically happens in real life, but the tone doesn't portray that. It reads to me as if the first two acts understood the thematic assignment, but the final act doesn't know how to close it off in a meaningful way. Maybe I'm just bitter because the insane Twitter hype made me set unrealistically high expectations and thus made me more critical than usual, but any way I look at it, the ending and the big reveal itself just did not work for me. Anyway, back to the grotesqueness of man. We flash back to the 1980s, where we see the neighborhood in a prosperous sitcom-esque form, with the house occupied by a despicable man called Frank, the real monster of the film. It's an uncomfortably uncanny scene, as its vivid yet artificially idealistic art direction contrasts immensely with what we just saw, as keeping with the theme of uncertain and false appearances, Frank is shown to hide behind a quiet demeanor that makes him seemingly difficult to read. By this point, despite the fact we know he's evil, his neighbors just treat him as shy and introverted, yet we get a great feel for what his character truly is with the way the camera shadows behind him with a similar claustrophobia as before, which is made even more jarringly noticeable in the wider spacious setting. There's subtle positioning to his character within the frame that make him appear domineering over others, with his arrival at a future victim's house conveyed with an emotional coldness, as if he's calculated to cause nothing but harm. Like with OG Michael Myers, he looks and feels like a force of evil. In such a short scene, we learn everything about his character purely through presence, so when it comes time to enter the basement once again, instead of following him, the camera waits anxiously by the door, too terrified to witness the horrors within. We echo the same instincts as Tess. We can sense it, feel it, we know he's up to something diabolical without ever having to see it. Back in the present scenario, both characters eventually escape, with AJ coming face to face with a frail, sickly Frank on his deathbed. It's a compelling scene that expands further on misleading, uncertain, and complex appearances. AJ discovers Frank's barbaric videotapes and realizes that this dying, scared, innocent-looking man isn't the victim, but the actual perpetrator, and stares down on him with judgment, not realizing they both have something partly in common. The film takes this outwardly threatening looking character like Frank, rots him into a monster dying in the darkness it created, and then frames AJ as the comic relief, this entertaining douchebag thanks to Justin Long's magnetic performance. But the thing is, his own innocuous looking appearance and seemingly dim-witted behaviour contorts the reality that he is also a coercive manipulative sex pest. Very different extremes, but ultimately both pieces of shit. It cleverly plays on typecasting. We all know Richard Brake and by extension Bill Skarsgård can act scary, so there's an inherent tension that already exists with their presence. But Justin Long, on the other hand, is cast in such a unique position of looking and acting like the least harmful person you could ever meet, but actually being harmful, especially since he proves incapable of accepting responsibility for his actions. In fact, AJ describes himself as persistent, downplaying his behaviour as a harmless trait, which actually contrasts with Keith, describing himself in a similar light because of his chivalrous, helpful way he was raised by his mother. So again, we're seeing how complex and broad these concepts and behaviours are, and how they change from person to person. Like I said earlier, he does try to admit fault once outside the house, pondering how far in which direction his character stands on the moral line, but once they're attacked by the woman again, he basically throws Tess under the bus, or rather off the water tower, so that the woman would jump off to save Tess, who the mother has seemingly adopted as her loving child. AJ then proceeds to pathetically justify himself when he discovers Tess survived the fall, only for the woman to awaken, understandably gouge out his eyes, before Tess shoots her dead at the end. Barbarian is about cruel intentions masked in everyday life and behind closed doors. I don't think it sticks the landing in bringing together all its themes, but I can't deny it elevates its characters with artful subtlety as they plunge into humanity's darkness, where the story's real demon spews in its own pitiful empire of poison. Seriously, fuck Frank.